side of NEDCC, which is preservation services. And what they do is they mainly do webinars and presentations, but then they also do assessments and a lot more than that. So they also they would be at the end of the hotline should there be a catastrophic event happening at your institution and you need help right away. So we have a 24-hour hotline and someone is on the end of that. It's usually a preservation specialist. So next. Sorry, I'm so sorry. So we're going to begin with some of the most fundamental elements of preservation, including key concepts, how to select items and their value, as well as how preservation and access relate to one another. Preservation is a set of ongoing activities that reduce or prevent damage to extend the life expectancy of collections. Preservation and conservation often get used interchangeably, but conservation refers more to the physical treatment of individual items, whereas preservation takes a more holistic approach to prevent damage. Preservation is an underlying responsibility of any collections caretaker, not just librarians or curators, but of course town clerks and municipal records holders too. This goes for private collectors as well, and those representing historical societies. We are all responsible not only for collecting, interpreting, and exhibiting significant materials that document history, but also for the long-term preservation, security, and accessibility of these materials. In the American Association of Museums Code of Ethics, it states that a museum must ensure that the collections in its custody are protected, secure, unencumbered, cared for, and preserved. This attitude is present in local history collections and historical societies as well. Preservation has a lot to do with knowing your collections and prioritizing the materials that need the most help to survive. For local history records and rare books and personal papers or other unique items that have some historical or other significance, we need to establish policies for care and handling that will protect our most valuable items. The primary goal of preservation is to prolong the existence of cultural property and records of enduring value. There are two parts of this: preventive preservation and remedial preservation involving physical and chemical deterioration. So the selection for preservation is really based on aspects of value. Archival theory has a very specific term for value, but I'm keeping these a tad generic for this webinar. Some items may have primarily informational value. For example, I'm sure of us have lots of scrapbooks made only of newspaper clippings. More often than not, the value is in that aggregate of information found in the clippings, not in the individual clippings or in the scrapbook itself. Here's another example. A lot of organizations will have press offices that will keep clipping books over the years and years, and these will eventually be passed on to the archives. So are these artifacts, or are they only valuable for their information? What about a book with ornate bindings and covers so it has artifactual value in addition to informational value? In circulating libraries, you're likely to value items based on use. This is a form of research value. This could take the form of identifying items for repair, replacement, or reformatting as they come through circulation and you see damage. Other items may have intrinsic value because they came from a certain person or era, or it has a certain cool factor. Archives do not generally keep bank receipts because it's routine information usually found in other sources like a report. But if there's a bank receipt signed by Abraham Lincoln, then it has intrinsic value. These different types of value, informational, research, and intrinsic, will all affect how you select for preservation. Again, it's important to think this is an artifact because it has cool bindings, or is it valuable for the information contained? What qualities does an artifact have? So let's think about back to that definition of preservation, that it's a set of ongoing activities to extend the life of expectancy of collections. What this really means is that we are ensuring the long-term access of these materials. You're not just preserving materials themselves, you're preserving the ability to access them for as long as possible or as long as necessary. Use is a key consideration when it comes to project planning, to allocating resources and prioritizing for rehousing or reformatting projects. It extends to larger concepts too. If your collection is stored in 3 buildings and none have an emergency plan, start with the central building with the most occupied space first, and then plan for the other less used buildings. Another reason that this is a useful concept to keep in mind is that when you're making the case to administrators and granting agencies for funding to support preservation, preservation really can't be sold in isolation. Both in advocacy and in practice, it must be tied to access. Sadly, it's not always a topic people get excited about. And in fact, some preservation administrators have suggested that instead of calling it preservation, when asking for funding, we should try rebranding it, calling it long-term access, which is something people in general can get behind a little bit better for whatever reason. To be effective, a preservation program really has to have the ability to stay in motion. It has to be sustainable over time, and access can be the promotional carrot to guarantee long-term support. So since we are focusing on paper and paper-based materials for this webinar, we need to understand a little bit of the history and physical makeup of paper itself, and to better identify deterioration and develop solutions for managing that deterioration. It's important to understand the materials in our collections as objects, as things that are made. By looking at how they're made and what they're made of, we can better understand how and why they fall apart. Paper is made of a slurry of natural fibers like linen or cotton rags that contain cellulose, which is what forms the walls of plant cells. Here you can see some of these cellulose fibers at a high magnification. Cellulose is also used in the production of plastics like acetate and celluloid, but they also share common principles of organic compounds. We just need to know how the cellulose base behaves as paper and how it interacts with other components to weaken or strengthen the paper. It can also contain an acidic substance called lignin, which bonds the cellulose fibers together, and will be mentioned in more detail later. Sorry, my cursor is not behaving. So a little bit of history about paper making. 100 AD, it was first developed in China using old rags. Basically, the process involves pressing textiles into flat sheets. As you can see in the image on your screen, there's you can see the big vat full of slurry in the foreground with 2 people using a screen to pick up the fibers in rectangles. Then they press it up into the big vertical surface, and these are basically the essential steps of paper making, and it hasn't changed a lot since. And we also have seen paper, often Asian paper, made up of mulberry fibers, which are crushed and filtered with fine screens. Japanese paper is what we commonly use in the paper conservation lab, in the book lab too, for repairs because of its long fibers. It's very strong paper to use for repair work. And then, next slide. This cursor, I'm so sorry, y'all. So paper was commonly available in the 15th century in Europe. A lot of Europeans were experimenting with different formulas and methods from about 1100 onwards for efficiency. Up until the mid-19th century, paper was commonly made of discarded cotton or linen rags. And in the photo or in the image, you can see ladies at work picking and shredding the textile rags to make a clean, even pulp. It was processed by hand, which made it a great stable paper. In addition to being durable and permanent, it retained a high degree of fiber strength. It was chemically stable, and good cotton and linen rags meant little to no lignin. Lignin pulp remained the main source of paper throughout the 17th and 18th. Sorry, that's wrong. Sorry. Oh, linen pulp. Sorry, I thought I read lignin. We'll talk about that in a minute. Linen pulp remained the main source of paper throughout the 17th and 18th centuries and was a very fine quality paper. So here comes the Industrial Revolution, and more people are reading and they are demanding more books, which meant more paper production. And that's when wood pulp became a viable option thanks to the mechanized processes and machines like wood grinders. Wood pulp introduces the first of several factors leading to the decline of durable paper. We are met with brittle paper problem. Paper at the time had a very high lignin content, and which was very acidic. Beaters with metal blades were used to break down raw materials into pulp very quickly, as opposed to the wooden mallets and human labor that were previously used. It shortened the long cellulose fibers we saw in the first slide, which gave handmade papers its strength to begin with. So paper fibers became weaker and less durable. And had low fiber strength and the lignin acidity. They're both examples of inherent vice and affects much of our paper-based collections today. I'm going to take a sip of water, by the way. Sorry. This is very frustrating. I'm so sorry. So during the industrial age, brought a variety of printing processes. Early printing was slow and expensive, but it became very quickly more affordable. Commercial production increased dramatically through the 19th century and produced the first printed ephemera, which were cheap paper products that document an event or place. Cities and towns started producing daily newspapers, which were full of colorful ads, elaborate lettering and illustrations, and riveting headlines. Printed ephemera like tickets, flyers, advertising cards, and more became available, and it meant that the general public had cheap, colorful paper at their disposal for the first time in history. This was a really exciting time. There was this amazing surge in publications and journals and all sorts of things. Just like we might feel bombarded by Twitter and Facebook and blog posts and anything related to COVID-19, people in the 19th century felt overwhelmed by this new availability of print materials. So next I wanted to talk about parchment a little bit. It was one of the other, another common material that would fall under paper, but pose its own deterioration, storage, and handling issues. Paper making took several hundred years for it to travel to Europe and beyond. So through the 12th century, parchment was actually the preferred medium. Parchment, which is an animal-based material, it's skin, was not as plentiful as paper, but it presented some of its own special concerns because of the way it was manufactured and how it responded to the environment. It can be very durable, but also somewhat stiff, depending on quality and thickness. And it has a natural neutral pH, but is extremely susceptible to high humidity and moisture. Wet or very high humidity can result in shape-shifting or warping, or which is commonly called in the lab cockling or planar distortion. So you might hear those terms as well. During manufacture, parchment is stretched and then dried to create a flat, wrinkle-free surface for writing. It's a very smooth surface. And then in this image, you can see a parchment text block you can see how it's warped and cockled and has been exposed in such a way to the environment that has produced this situation, which can be, this item can be, was conserved and came out quite nicely. Next, we're going to talk about photography. We need to, photography falls into paper conservation, but because of the chemical makeup of it, the complexity of photography, we do have a photograph conservator on staff who handles all photograph conservation. We will turn, so the development of photography, because it does have a big impact on our collections, was anyway, something, anyway, sorry, I'm sorry. So we'll discuss the development of photography and the, so pictured here is the earliest surviving camera photograph taken in France in 1826 or 27 or so. From these very first grainy experiments with light, the development of photography happened very quickly. And because there were so many people experimenting with different chemicals and processes over the world. Photography was a very democratic technology, and it quickly became a commercialized process and was made available just to about anyone, not just the wealthy who could afford just about anything. Photographers experimented with both wet and dry methods, using glass or metal plates coated in different combinations of chemicals to create a negative and then to print images. And all these processes introduce preservation concerns because they're so different. So lastly, we'll take a look at digital prints. And of course, this is, 20th, 21st century thing we see. In 2018, we don't or 2020, we don't often see the traditional photographic printing processes, and we've moved into the digital realm. Developments in digital technology have introduced new methods of printing, producing, and utilizing photographs. Digital printing is different from photography. There's no light-sensitive process occurring in the print, and we call these photomechanical prints. And they have their own set of problems. Inkjet prints can be one of the most common modern formats, and there are two types of inkjet prints. Inkjet inks, excuse me, dye and pigment. The top picture is a magnification of dye ink, and the bottom is pigment ink. And dye inkjet ink is less stable and sensitive to light and moisture. You'll see them oftentimes in water emergencies where they are the worst damaged because the ink is water soluble and the image disappears. Dye has gotten a lot better than it used to be and is still much cheaper than pigment. Laser printers are not really used for printing images or artworks. They're designed for bulk printing processes such as office documents. They're less water soluble and less light sensitive to fading from exposure to light. And they use the powdered ink that has been electrically charged and then heat sealed to the paper. So next, we're going to talk about agents of deterioration, and starting off with inherent vice, which is something we enjoy dealing with on a regular basis, and that's which you'll see oftentimes in your newsprint, your ephemeral materials. The deterioration of our collections is not only about the weaknesses produced during the manufacturing process. It's really an interplay between inherent traits and external factors, and all of these factors interact with materials to accelerate their deterioration. We've talked about inherent traits of weakness, like brittle paper problem. We call this inherent vice, and I'll show you what that looks like in paper and in photographs. External causes of deterioration include heat, humidity, light, pollution, and pests. And then we'll focus on storage practices and materials as well as proper handling. Inherent vice. As we learned in the history part earlier, as paper manufacture developed, the permanence of durability and paper of paper decreased. Harmful acids from lignin, which I mentioned before, accelerated the paper's decomposition, and the mechanical pulp grinders made paper fibers very short. These are excellent examples of inherent vice. They also include chlorine bleaching, which was introduced around the late 18th century, which gave paper a brighter white shade, and alum rosin sizing, which is an acidic compound that was introduced in the US around 1830. The sizing was used to smooth paper and make it acceptable for writing. Sorry. So inherent vice is a major issue when it comes to photographic materials too. Cellulose film bases introduced at the turn of the 19th century. Nitrate and acetate have preservation challenges because of their composition. Even in cold storage and with the best care, these films are going to degrade. And I could say the same thing for newspapers, any type of wood pulp based cheaper materials. Even with conservation, we can slow down the degradation. We can't fully stop it. It's an important concept to grasp. The reality is that a lot of our collection materials are built to deteriorate. Nitrate film is extremely combustible and off-gases as it decomposes. The telltale signs of nitrate film are fading and curling. Acetate film also releases gases as it decomposes. It breaks down and forms acetic acid as it decomposes, which we call vinegar syndrome. Vinegar is basically diluted food-grade acetic acid, so we know our acetate film is moving into more rapid decomposition when it begins having the distinct vinegar odor. The acetic acid feeds the cycle and makes decomposition occur at a higher and higher rate. So the preservation environment is an important one. The storage environment is responsible for speeding or slowing the external causes of deterioration, which include a few particular considerations: temperature, humidity, light, and pollutants. So moving on to that first one, temperature. Extreme conditions can cause your archival materials to dry out or to deteriorate at a higher pace. High heat in particular catalyzes chemical reactions, which causes an increasing degradation speed. Paper will be brittle, brittle more quickly. You'll see red rot, and nitrate and acetate film will degrade very rapidly, resulting in image loss. And color film, whether still image or motion picture, fades very quickly at higher temperature, and the dyes will lose stability. Our collections are more comfortable in the same environment that we are, at around 68 to 70 degrees. However, temperature is always better lower. Dedicated storage or people that are not working in the area, you might want to drop the temperature to about 55 degrees if that's possible. The cooler you can go, the more slowly the chemical reactions occur. So relative humidity, something we like to keep an eye on in addition to the temperature. Paper and photographs and vellum are hygroscopic, which means they readily absorb and release moisture. They respond to seasonal changes in temperature and relative humidity by expanding and contracting. And dimensional changes appear as visible damage like cockling paper, flaking ink, and cracked emulsion on photographs. Like I said, parchment is especially sensitive to fluctuations in humidity. Relative humidity, or RH, refers to the amount of water vapor in the air compared to how much total water could be held in the room at that temperature. Air with 50% relative humidity at 65 degrees is holding half as much water than it could if the air was saturated and it started to rain. If the temperature of that air increased to 70 degrees, the RH would decrease as a proportional amount. In high humidity, when you're experiencing high humidity, the moisture in the air catalyzes chemical reactions and promotes mold and pests. And low humidity, you end up drying out the paper and creating brittle pages and cause materials to contract and experience dimensional changes. So consider the location of your stored items. Are you in a region of the country that traditionally has very high or very low humidity? I'm not familiar with what the climate is in Missouri, but it's just something to consider. And are objects stored under a vent where the air is changing throughout the day? If you do have items that are stored in areas that are near a vent system, you might want to consider moving them if that's possible. You also want to maintain a stable low to mid level humidity for your items, ideally between 30% and 55%. It can be very difficult, but setting up a dehumidifier in your storage area will do a lot to help your collections if you are located in a humid region. But you'll want to make sure your RH doesn't drop too low. So we'll discuss pollutants a little bit. With the focus on RH and temperature, one aspect of preservation that we might not immediately consider is air quality and the gaseous and particulate matter entering the storage space. Pollutants can enter through open windows and chimneys or even be carried in on patrons and staff. Particulate pollutants come from skin cells, soot, fiber, hair, pollen, etc. Just what we know is general dust, and it can attract insects, but it can also be abrasive and react with collection materials. And it's worth noting that the effect of these will be worse in areas with high temperature and humidity. Gaseous pollutants come from outside sources like traffic exhaust or indoor sources like cleaning solutions or electrical equipment. Sometimes your cleaning products might emit peroxide or ammonia, and it's good to know that photocopiers emit oxides. Review what's happening in and around your collection. Is there any renovation or construction work going on inside or outside? Is there construction happening? Construction is a major source of environmental pollutants. And think about if you're near a highway or near manufacturing. Now, I will say, I know there have been a lot of renovation projects going on. Something to consider if you're planning a renovation project is considering the materials that are going to be used, like carpeting and the adhesives and the paints. What kind of off-gassing will occur? A lot of times, it's you want to think greener. A lot of buildings are trying to become LEED certified. Well, it's great for the environment, it's great for the people, but think about your collections as well. And so something to consider. So in the lower left-hand picture, you can see the effects of pollution in the air with the darkening of the edges. And also this book is, wood pulp based book. And so, but the environment has exacerbated that degradation. In some photographs, air pollutants, temperature, relative humidity create a sustained migration of silver ions in all directions. And when these silver ions reach the print surface, they form a reflective layer of silver or silver mirroring which is that reflective sheen with the bluish cast. And it occurs where there is sufficient silver, and usually in the darker toned areas of the image. Light. So light is a big concern that is experienced by museums and libraries. Just review what's happening in and around your collection. Is there any renovation or construction work going on inside or outside? Oh, I'm sorry, wrong slide, sorry. Like heat, light provides energy to chemical reactions, accelerating deterioration. Light exposure can cause permanent fading and yellowing, and damage is usually irreversible. You want to think about your blueprints and diazo prints, which are especially sensitive to light exposure and can fade easily. If such items are on display, they should be replaced with high quality facsimiles and the originals placed in folders and safely stored in drawers or archival tubes if they're too large to store flat. Consider the amount of light the materials will be exposed to. Are lights frequently left on in the room where your collections are stored? Are there windows? Do those windows have curtains or shades that can be drawn? Or are you using fluorescent light? So now we get to mold, which is the gross problem that we experience from time to time. Mold is everywhere. Mold and mildew, they're types of fungi, microorganisms that depend on, other organisms for sustenance. There are over 100,000 known species of fungi. Some strains of mold can be dangerous to people and can, in some cases, pose a major health hazard. It's important to identify and isolate any growths. You want to stop it before, stop it from spreading to people, and of course, but also to your healthy collections. For safety reasons, mold remediation should be conducted by a trained professional. Anyone with respiratory problems or health issues should be especially cautious of working around moldy items, but please have protective equipment on hand in case mold is discovered unexpectedly. It can be of any color, different textures, and look different, so just play it safe. And then we have pests. Hopefully your institutions are free of them. Cockroaches and silverfish, moths, beetles, mice, rats, and even bats can all affect collections. Directly by nesting in or eating materials, or indirectly through their droppings. Keeping your collections away from, keep your collections away from any food or clutter, as garbage draws pests of all types. Many insects like damp, warm, and often dim environments. And mice, unfortunately, like to join us when it gets cold outside, and our homes and our buildings offer a warm place to hole up. If you do find an infestation, it's important to speak with a conservator before you call in an exterminator. Many pesticides and gases will damage your collections. So we'll talk about storage. While the chemical and biological agents of deterioration are broad environmental causes of damage, we ourselves or our predecessors may have also inadvertently caused problems through improper storage, which result in mechanical damage. The good news is that with a little organization and thought, we can do a lot to prevent or minimize mechanical damage through good storage and handling practices. So, check for weak shelving, overhanging items, or things stacked on top of each other. Just things that are boxed in boxes that are not the right size for the item itself. So another thing that can cause damage is mishandling of materials. You want to keep books supported while turning pages. Don't, just cradle them as best you can. And when you have to stack materials, especially oversized items, stacking on the shelves 3 high max. So, and of course it depends on the item. So if you have a scrapbook with fragile materials inside, ideally put them in a box. You can stack the box one on another as long as they're sturdy enough. Don't ever, I mean, I shouldn't have to tell you this, but, folded over corners of pages will cause damage. So, I feel like I'm talking to the choir right here. So unfortunately, things that are, out of our control can happen. And we want to, we can only do our best to prepare and to mitigate. Emergencies like flooding and fire affect our collections, our staff, and everything in our buildings. And then there are those, of course, accidents and incidents from humans. Maybe it's an accident, or it could be an intentional thing like a political act, or during a theft, a painting gets damaged. In any case, it's important to be vigilant about security and careful handling. As you can see on the right, the photograph is of a painting that was damaged in 1914 by the suffragette Mary Richardson, who walked into the National Gallery and attacked Velázquez's canvas with a meat cleaver. So things happen. So now that we've covered deterioration factors like mechanical damage to paper and photographs, and then talked about identifying the risks in overall storage environment, we'll now get a little bit more granular and go over best practices for storing, housing, and handling our materials properly. So here are a few examples of poor storage choices, or maybe no decisions being made from an inherited space. On the upper right, this looks like one of those catch-all spaces that just gets worse and worse, and no one wants to deal with it until there's a big leak or all the boxes fall over. The big picture on the left is concerning because much of the materials is sitting directly on the ground. We recommend 3 to 4 inches of clearance off the ground for all shelves and boxes, which provides a lot of protection of our materials, especially if there's flooding. Most shelves are constructed with 3 inches of clearance, and this is sufficient. I've also seen a lot of folded up oversized items getting crushed, and such as in this photo, and a lot of acidic paper wrapped around things and non-archival supplies being used. If this looks familiar, don't panic. Just a little bit of organization and making sure everything's stacked nicely and covered from dust can be a big improvement, even if you can't rehouse everything and flatten it all for now. So here are some examples of what you don't want to see within storage containers. No unruly stacks of photographs, no sticky old album pages. You can see how wrinkly that one is on the right. It's degraded plastic, and it can end up sticking to your photographs and warping them or discoloring them. If you have a collection of negatives and prints, it's a good idea to store the negatives in separate locations from the prints, or at least in different boxes. Good storage practice starts with good enclosures. We'll go over storage from item level up so that it's from the enclosure. So that's from the enclosure for a single item to the storage environment. So paper enclosures are great. We'll talk a little bit about the different varieties of supplies you'll be using to wrap or encase your artifacts or documents. When preparing your materials for storage, you will choose either plastic or paper enclosures, and probably use some of each type in different situations. Of course, you always want to use archival quality materials from a reputable supplier. But what does that mean? First, I talk about archival quality paper products. Archival paper in boxes means storage materials made out of acid-free, lignin-free, and buffered paper. If you go to Staples or Office Depot, you might see acid-free paper on the package, because it had a pH of about 7 at the time of manufacture. However, there's not a guarantee of quality since archival, the term archival isn't standardized. An archival vendor like Gaylord or Hollinger, you can be certain that the materials are stable and appropriate for historic items. Besides buying lignin-free products, you also want to look for buffered paper, which has an alkaline substance impregnated in the paper to elevate the pH. But don't use those for blueprints or cyanotype prints, and a few other sensitive photomechanical processes. Lastly, there's also microchamber paper that's also a product that has something in it that will help mitigate or protect your object if there's something in that object's, well, it is oftentimes used as a lining to protect the object. Sorry, I don't have the best explanation for that at this moment. So boxes. So it'll protect your materials from environmental factors like light and dust, and provides a buffer against changes in temperature and humidity. And it's also makes it easy to label and store your items. On the slide, there are examples of phase boxes, clamshells, and drop front boxes, which you can purchase the right box for your items. From a professional conservation lab or bookbinder, a custom clamshell box will cost you around $200 to $300, but there are pre-made options available from vendors like Gaylord or Hollinger, but the cost can add up quickly and they won't be as precise of a fit. You're better off going with a truly custom box from a private professional for your most valuable volumes. So bound volumes do really well in their own or individual boxes. Boxes that are significantly larger than their contents will allow items to shift, making damage more likely to occur. Boxes that are too small will compress items and cause creases and tears, and you can have issues trying to remove items from the box, including just scraping the sides and pulling corners off. You just want to make sure you have a good fit. And don't overfill your boxes either, because this can lead to damage from handling, just getting them in and out. And don't underfill your boxes, because this allows the folders to slump and bend and warp. Storage that includes foldering and boxing. Loose documents and oversized works of paper need to be in folders within boxes. And remember that you want to have an appropriately sized folder within an appropriate sized box. The main thing to keep in mind is folders should not be overfilled. In practice, this means you probably do not want to put more than 15 to 20 sheets in each folder. If you're working with fragile materials, even fewer per folder. Papers that compose a single intellectual unit and consist of more than 20 pages, something like a script would be a good example. In this situation, take a look at your folder and use the pre-scored lines to fold the bottom into an appropriate size. Doing so ensures that all the pages are evenly supported. If you were to put the document in without folding along the score line, the pages closest to the folder can curl in and warp at the bottom, and the pages in the middle would begin to push out over the top of the folder, where they are at risk from handling damage. It's also best if similarly sized items can be stored in the same folder so that they provide structural support for each other. You'll hear me refer to folders and boxes being appropriately sized and filled. This means that we need to find the right balance collection materials to store enclosures at each level. So here is a way to use foldering as a way to store flat sheets and photos and documents. Of note here are the photo corners, which are a great way to secure artworks, whether used in matting and framing or as they are here to keep an object secure in storage. I'm not referring to the peel and stick kind, the self-adhesive corners that you can purchase at any old craft store, because that adhesive, we don't know what it's made of, and over time it could fail and shift, and a lot of times we see adhesive kind of migrate where it could end up touching the artifact, and that is something we don't want to see. It's easier and safer to make them by folding strips of archival quality paper and then taping them down. In this case, there's a suitable archival paper barrier between the tape and the photo that they're securing. So you're not going to worry about migration in that case. If you have flat file cases for storing oversized photos and prints, make sure your folders are the correct size for the drawer. Same idea. If you want the folder to fill the drawer snugly, or you want the folder to fill the drawer snugly, not slide around inside, but not too big and stick out either. Here's a photograph that has been mounted with photo corners on a piece of mat board that is approximately 2 inches larger in each dimension. Mounting to an oversized piece of mat board makes it easier for people to handle the object and prevents the chance of fingerprints accidentally marring the photo's surface. Additionally, the mat board can be excellent quality, 100% rag paper. There may be no need to place interleaving sheets between each object in a group, so a similar or related item can be stacked together in a single drop front archival box. So we also, like I just mentioned earlier, plastic enclosures, polyester sleeves are helpful. They're great at protecting paper and photographic materials from direct handling and abrasion. And the benefit is that you can see clearly what's inside. Melanex is the most stable option, but polyethylene and polypropylene are also safe to use as well. You do want to be very sure that you're not purchasing vinyl or polyvinyl chloride or PVC, both of which degrade rapidly and off gas. You want to avoid the unknowns. And if it smells like a shower curtain, a plastic shower curtain, then that's what you want to avoid. You also might see products with an anti-static coating. You don't want to use those. The static is what helps keep the item in place. And some plastic enclosures may have one sticky edge for sealing envelopes, but you need to be very careful with those. That you don't want to end up with your object hitting that adhesive surface and sticking to that, because pulling it away, it'll be a problem. So sleeving and encapsulation, it adds bulk and weight to collections and can increase the amount of shelf space needed to store materials. It can be very costly, and it is wise to use them selectively for items that are fragile or vulnerable to abrasion. And a lot of times encapsulations can be done in-house. But we often hear the suggestion to use double-sided tape and sheets of polyester to encapsulate documents. And the problem with that is that items shift, and again, they can get stuck to the edge and tear the edge of the object, and it requires solvents to remove them. You have to be extremely careful about that. So like in our facility, we have a heat sealing encapsulator as well as ultrasonic welding encapsulator. But you can buy pre-made sheets from places like Hollinger and Gaylord. And I know I'm getting close on time, like really close, and we haven't even gotten to talking about dealing with collections during the pandemic. So I mean, are we good on time? I mean, do you want me to keep going and talking about this?
It might be helpful if you just skip to some of the pandemic things at this point.
All right. I'm not to, not to blame anybody, but my colleague, she helped me with this, and she did remove a lot of the slides that would have taken up some time. So I guess it's still a little long. Okay. So here we are. We want to move on to our last topic, which is how to plan for reopening, where collections and staff are safety are concerned. Museums might not experience as much handling or as much or any handling of artifacts from patrons, but archives may. So many of the questions we've been getting at NEDCC have revolved around the topic of how to best disinfect collections materials. At NEDCC, we have a long-running series of preservation leaflets that I highly recommend you check out if you, and they're at the top of our page, and discuss every type of object you need to know how to, care for. It talks about objects, it talks about environment. They're really excellent. It's an excellent resource for caring for collections, and they're available for free. So if you're not familiar with them, I recommend checking them out. In the light of the current pandemic and the inquiries we've been receiving, we decided to add a leaflet on this topic of disinfecting collections, which you see at the top of the screen. One of the most important things to note is that the CDC believes the odds of transmission via circulating materials is very low. They're working with other public entities to evaluate the safety of holding the general election via mail-in vote this fall, and they're not worried about the transmission through those materials either. In general, they're saying that porous paper-based materials aren't great media for the virus. I highly recommend watching IMLS's webinar called Mitigating COVID-19 when managing paper-based circulating and other types of collections. It will certainly ease any concerns. Or many concerns. And the Smithsonian's Cultural Rescue Hub is also an excellent resource for collecting entities as it relates to COVID-19 and is updated regularly, and I suggest bookmarking that. With that said, we're recommending a 72-hour quarantine of collections items as the absolute safest and most effective way to disinfect them after handling by staff and patrons. There was a study published as a correspondence in the New England Journal of Medicine in March, which is also linked on screen, that showed that COVID-19 can persist on cardboard surfaces for 24 hours and on plastic surfaces for up to 72 hours. Based on this research, an appropriate quarantine time for paper or plain cardboard products would be a minimum of 24 hours, while an appropriate quarantine time for books covered in polyester, such as Mylar or other plastics, as well as any other plastic-based materials like CDs and DVDs, is 72 hours. Time is the disinfectant if you when you're talking about paper-based collections. So you might see that there's advice floating around that recommends a full 9 days of quarantine. That recommendation is based on a hospital sanitation study that demonstrated that one specific type of coronavirus, which was not a SARS type, could persist for 9 days. If you have the space and ability to quarantine materials for that long, you can, but advice coming from the medical field is that it's likely unnecessary. Although again, if it makes you or your patrons feel safer, there's certainly no harm in quarantining for that long. So then, disinfecting books and other collections, part 2. I want to separate out cleaning because it's important to note that unless you are a trained conservator, the only cleaning or repair that you should be doing on collections is gentle surface cleaning. Really basic dusting with a soft brush or a dry cleaning sponge, as you can see on the screen. We have a preservation leaflet on doing that as well. And it was updated last year with the link. You never want to apply any liquids or chemicals to your documents or photographs. Again, leave that to the trained conservator. Oops, sorry. I'm losing my, there we go. It might be a little stressful, but it's okay. We know that quarantining materials works and it's completely safe and effective way to care for your collections during this time. I'm getting close to the end, y'all. So thinking of staff safety, it's incredibly important during this time. We obviously don't want to put anyone at risk of infection. Staff can wear disposable nitrile gloves, and they should immediately remove the gloves afterwards so they do not accidentally spread germs to anything else or to themselves, such as by touching a door handle or touching one's face with gloves still on. It's likely that you already have gloves like these available, particularly if you have special collections, special or archival collections. And as an aside, we always recommend powder-free nitrile or latex gloves rather than cotton when handling collections materials, as they fit more snugly to your hand and allow for improved dexterity. They're an important tool to have even in a non-emergency situation. However, gloves, talking about gloves, when handling historic books or paper artifacts, having clean, dry hands is recommended. But if materials may have been contaminated, wash your hands immediately after. It's a matter of comfort level to the individual whether they want to wear gloves or not. Unlike mold, where we would recommend the use of gloves because some molds can cause skin irritation, the virus is not transmitted through the skin. That said, and we've been hearing it for now more than ever, hand washing is of utmost importance to prevent the spread of germs. The CDC page we linked on the screen includes some hand washing posters and fact sheets that you can print and hang within your facility to help encourage healthy habits of staff and of patrons. So you might want to check that out too. So here we go. We're at the end and we have some additional resources. And I'm going to make these available, well, Amanda and Linda will make them available to you. But I just wanted to let you know that we do have all of these regarding sanitizing your collections and your facility. And they're not methods or products to be applied to collections, but are appropriate for things like desks, light switches, doorknobs, and other high touch surfaces. And then we also have, sorry, I've scrolled through. So here we go, sanitizing collections, sanitizing your facility, and then thinking about your disaster plan. And we have the first resource listed here was created by NEDCC and the Massachusetts Board of Library Commissioners. We're actually in the beta testing phase for a relaunch of D-Plan, which is with a really nice, sleek new interface. Basically, it's a template for creating a disaster plan for your collection. You can still access the original site, but the new one will be even better. And it's a good idea to consider, a pandemic now in your disaster plan. And that's it. So thank you so much. I'm sorry I went over and got stuck on a couple of things. It's my first webinar, so hopefully you were able to bear with me. So please let me know if you have questions. We can also take them, I can answer them if we can't answer them right now. So there you go, thank you.
Tahe, thank you very much. It was a really great webinar. Congratulations on finishing your first one.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Touch on everything.
So we do have a few questions in the chat that we might try to get to, and I'm very curious whether or not anyone has any further questions on reopening, particularly for archives material or for general library circulating materials. So first off, someone asked if you had any thoughts on using hand sanitizers and then handling paper-based collections afterwards.
So yeah, that's come up a lot. And even in the conservation dist list that I read every day, the unscented hand sanitizers, the ethanol is what is the killing agent. It's good to have the hand sanitizers. They have to be unscented, no additives, like moisturizers. So unscented, non-moisturizing hand sanitizers should be fine. That's totally fine.
Good to know. You had mentioned that UV is not recommended, UV light. So someone had asked about UV wand scanners. I presume those are out as well, or?
Yeah, I think so. So any type of exposure to UV light, again, like I said, the best disinfectant is, you just don't want to take that risk. I mean, we try so hard to avoid exposing our collections to UV, with films on our windows and tubes, sleeves on our lights, and changing light bulbs. We just don't recommend it. We recommend time being the disinfectant.
I actually had a question for you really quickly. This goes back not to the COVID-19, although I would say that a lot of people are using this time of closure for renovations. You mentioned to be aware of things that might off-gas, or that there may be some sort of byproduct that you want to be aware of. Would you have anything specific that you'd want to make us aware of that we could just keep in mind for future renovations?
Well, so I would say for sure, talking with the people who are involved, the stakeholders, the architect, the designer, the people who are involved in the renovation process, making sure that you have very clear guidelines as to what you need for the space, in terms of protecting the collections. A lot of times it's like, like I said, I mean, it's like, oh, we want to go green, but then those green materials might not be suitable for collections. And I sat in on a webinar that the Library of Congress did. It was during Preservation Week, and it was about that very subject, and hopefully it's coming out soon as a recording, but it's one I recommend highly. It was probably one of the best talks that week, and I will certainly send it along once they make the recording available.
That'd be very helpful, thank you. I think we had one more question in the chat, and that was regarding Post-it notes. If adhesive from Post-it notes is considered harmful on a document, an archive document.
You don't want to put anything, I mean, even if it's like one of those repositionable type stickies, that adhesive, you don't want to ever put anything even as delicately sticky as a Post-it note on an artifact. And if you do need to use some kind of note, just a little strip of paper, or folder the item and put the sticky note on that foldered item. The problem with sticky notes, though, is that they start to curl, they start to, they can get lost, they come off easily, and then you end up not knowing what it was for. So I recommend using either writing, like putting the note like directly on the outside of the folder using pencil, or having, like a strip with the item. But foldering would probably be best. I'm trying to think of like what the sticky note would be. What would the purpose serve if a folder is not used? You know what I mean?
Perhaps during the processing stage.
During the processing, I guess. Just folders. You could even. So one thing that you can do is. Even like printer paper, just cutting strips of printer paper and then using that as a little wrapper. If it's wide enough, you can just create a little strip and crease the edges and then write on that, or write on that first and then slip it around your artifact.
Sounds like a good plan. We have another one in the chat. What kind of tape is recommended to use to secure photo corners?
So there is the white paper tape, and I can't think of the name of it right now. And this is like this is like in-house, like if you're having to do it. Normally we don't use photo corners in the conservation lab when we're framing items. We use hand-torn Japanese paper hinges with wheat starch paste to hinge our objects to the backing boards. But so probably the white paper tape, and again, I can't think of the name of it, but you can get it from Hollinger or maybe Talus or Gaylord. So under the conservation supplies, and I can make a note of that and get that information to you.
Sounds good. Well, we are running a little bit over time. We wanted to remind everybody that you will have Tahe's contact information. So if you have additional questions, please feel free to reach out to her for any future conversation. And we want to thank everybody for joining us today. I'm going to, before we end here, turn it over to my colleague, Linda Indersby, for some additional announcements. Tahe, thank you.
Yeah, thank you to Tahe as well. Just a couple things that were posted in the chats. MAMA is having a conference this fall, although it is not 100% certain whether it will be in person or virtual. But we have put out a call for proposals. So if you have anything that you want to present and share, that's out there for you. There's also an initiative that's starting this summer, Show Me Missouri Museums and Archives, in which they're going to be coordinating a program from a different Missouri institution each day over the course of this summer to have available to people across the state. And that was another thing that was posted in the chats. If you have any questions about anything, you can always email info@missourimuseums.org. And I will just thank you all for joining us. If you are not a member of MAMA and you found this valuable, I would encourage you to check it out. It's just a low individual membership of $20. But I do again want to thank Tahe for joining us and for all of you. So thank you.